Hello and welcome to number 2 in our archetypal back to basics series. So let's see what we have on for today, okay? There we have it. And we have air and water, which is the Patriarch. So that's the next one that we'll be having a look at. Now, the Patriarch is air and water, so air is his main element and water is his secondary element, or you could think of it as his inner element. And it's the element in a sense that he needs to be in touch with to be kind of fulfilling his purpose in a way. I think this is something that you find with the archetypes. The secondary element actually has a kind of like a strong inner quality to it, I think, and it's important for the consciousness to be in touch with that as well as the dominant element. The Patriarch, being air, is very concerned with consciousness and with the mind. Certainly very concerned with the mind, and the effect of this consciousness is to crystallize things and to make things into structures which have a very strong value to them, and a moral value very often. There's a great sense of authority to this archetype and dignity, and it gives a height to things. It gives a vertical dimension to things, which is very important. It's the consciousness that allows us to assess our own truthfulness, for instance, and allows us to assess our thinking, and allows us to see if our thinking is consistent and is following an honest course rather than simply going wherever we'd rather it would go to, and so it's a tremendously valuable consciousness. It's the consciousness that allows you to keep your word, that allows you to have principles, to have values, and to hold to those values. So it's also the consciousness which allows you to develop self-discipline at in a very natural way, in a sense, because it's discipline based upon the values which your heart accepts. That's it at its best, really. And so it's a very, very important archetype in that way. Now, when it gets blocked and when it loses its purpose, it becomes authoritarian, it becomes rigid, it becomes again, it becomes very controlling, just as the matriarch became very controlling, but it becomes controlling a different way. It becomes controlling by absolutely imposing its authority and insisting that people stand by its authority, and yes, it becomes rigid, it becomes unfeeling, it becomes incapable of seeing other people's perspectives, because there is only one true perspective for it when it's really in a shutdown state. And so there you see it becomes a kind of fundamentalism. And the Patriarch, we can see them in a lot of sort of like authoritarian religions. We can see them in most authoritarian structures, basically. The Patriarch, even its negative form, is basically the mental underpinning of authoritarianism. But again, just as the water is its inner purpose, the Patriarch is the capacity of the mind, in a sense, in service to the soul, in a sense, or in service to that which is beyond, just simply our material concerns. And so we find that this combination of things does give rise to this sense of what our values are and what we would hold to, even if it meant sacrificing things, or even if it meant suffering at times. Because of the importance of value in that sense, and the importance of inner value. So quite, well, a very important archetype, as they all are. You can see him reflected in all kinds of figures. You can see him to an extent in sort of like, in wizard figures in literature that have sort of authority. You could see him in, the figures of kings of the gods or kingly gods. So Zeus, to an extent, Odin. Though, of course, with many mythological figures, they are often more complex than this. Yeah, they are more nuanced because they are not just archetypes in a sense, if you see what I mean. But you can find him in all of these sorts of figures. You can even find him in Father Christmas. He's reflected very fully throughout our world in popes and priests and in rather stiff politicians and things like this. You can find him in all these different places with varying degrees of virtue and otherwise, So yes, a very important archetype for anything that we normally recognize as civilization, that which raises us above things, which is part of the problem as well as its virtue, because it raises us above and away from nature in a sense, which is one of the problems of it. But at the same time, it is what allows us to kind of civilize ourselves, with everything that entails, both good and bad, but you can't get away from the fact that it's an immensely important part of our functioning. Without the Patriarch, nobody would be able to be honest. Nobody would be able to follow a system of thinking honestly. Nobody would be able to hold any values. Nobody would be able to, everything would resolve to something far more primitive, and you'd find various results from that. But what you wouldn't get is the capacity to develop in certain respects. So it's certainly an important archetype. Like all of the archetypes, their real functioning, their best functioning, is based upon their coming into virtue, and I think that is partly down to their capacity for the two constituent elements to have a good relationship to each other. And so the Patriarch is air, coming from water in a sense. I think that's one way of looking at it in a way. But you can see all manner of things in all of the archetypes, and you can find all sorts of qualities in them, and you can see them in all sorts of places, and it's useful to have a look at these things and see where they are, and how these forms of consciousness play out in our lives. Anyway, I hope that's of interest and help, and good as a starter for studying this archetype.